I wish everyone a good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Last week, we introduced two new machabrim that we had not introduced in the past. One was Rabbi Meir Twersky, and the other was Rav Usher Zelig Weiss. I'm hoping that we'll come back to them later on today. I'd like to introduce two new machabrim to our discussion. One is Rabbi Yitzchok Zilberstein, one of the outstanding authors of halachic discussions in our time. And the other is Professor Avraham Steinberg, who is a real beautiful combination of Torah and Derech Eretz, spanning both worlds, the worlds of science and the worlds of halacha. His writings remind me, for any of you who might remember the old days of the RCA journal, which was called Tradition, and they used to have a review of recent halachic literature, and that's his style. He's written extensively on halachic issues, especially in the contemporary time. He has a major piece of work that goes on for at least 50 pages on this epidemic. And I'd like to focus your attention on approximately 5 pages towards the end of this kuntris, in which he introduces some basic sources regarding triage. And within medical ethics, and especially in the area of halacha, who comes first when we cannot supply medical treatment for everyone is a basic question. If you happen to have his essay in front of you, you may be able to find it in your email. And on page 38, he speaks about medical triage. He has 2 pages of introduction before that. And he starts with the very famous Gemara in Bab Metzia. 2 people are going on a wilderness road. One of them has a keton shalmayim, and neither of them could survive before they get to the Yishuv. And the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Petura. Ben Petura says we have to split the water, and they'll both die. Rabbi Akiva says that he's holding on to the keton, it's his water, he'll drink the water. We already see a situation of who comes first. He goes on to mention a Mishnah in Bab Metzia, which has to do with returning a lost object. To whom do we give triage? We give precedence. And a very famous sugya in Horios. On Daf Yud Gimel, the Gemara wants to know in terms of saving lives, pidyon shvuyim, redeeming captives, what is the hierarchy? Who comes first? And the Mishnah talks about a Kohen that comes first, then a Levi, then a Yisrael, and then a Mamzer, and even amongst non-Jews who converted to Judaism, there are different gradations. And these are the sugyas that establish a fundamental principle that we don't give up one life for the other. We have to decide who comes first in Hatzola, in saving, but ein dochin nefesh b'pnei nefesh. We would never be allowed to let one nefesh go and see its death for the sake of saving another nefesh. So if we keep that principle in mind, I'll come right back to it. Believe it or not, in our time, all these terrible halachas that are terrible in the sense that they are so difficult in matters of life and death, they all became quite relevant in our time. On page 37, he tells us that although the government is responsible for supplying whatever equipment and life-saving supplies are necessary, unfortunately, in this pandemic, he says, there are situations inevitably of triage because there are dilemmas that there aren't enough, whether it's life-saving support systems, ventilators and the like, or whether it's personnel, doctors, nurses. We've heard all sorts of stories. I don't have to tell them to you. And therefore, it's become a very, how shall I say, a very dramatic and serious situation. He quotes the Mishnah in Sanhedrin about the greatness of Hatzalah to save a life. The Mishnah says that Adam was created Yechidi, just one man, to teach you that if you save one man, it's as if you save the entire world. So that's the ultimate value, the highest value of human life. We call it Kedushas HaChayim, the sanctity and the value of life, which is a tremendous value. And he points out that the government is going to give us guidelines to prevent infection. And he says that we are obligated to follow these guidelines. And now he asks the major question. We have a mitzvah of Hatzalah. The Gemara derives it from a pasuk Hashev Teshivim. If we have to return a lost object, how much more so do we have to return a person's lost goof in a life-threatening situation? In addition, lo samad al dam reyacho, we have a lo saseh, not standing idly by while the blood of your fellow Jew is being spilled. He says that the only exception to the rule that a person, Chayecha Kodmin, which was Rabbi Akiva's principle, that first and foremost, he saves his life. He's not obligated to give over the water and forfeit his life for the sake of someone else's life. But the exception to that rule, in a case of Hatzalah, would be, according to some poskim, which he codifies them all here, in a case of health professionals. He says their very essential responsibility, physicians, healthcare workers, is to save lives. They're in a very unique position. And they may be not only permitted, but even obligated to save lives, even by endangering their own lives. Again, this only applies in a suffix situation where it's doubtful. And in our present dilemma of coronavirus, we're talking about many situations in which the healthcare professionals have to expose themselves. Obviously, they have to be protected by what he calls PPE, personal protective equipment. They have to try to supply ventilators, beds in the ICU department, and this is their responsibility. Again, just to summarize, he writes, it's incumbent upon the government to ensure, excuse me, whenever possible, that all supplies and all equipment that's required is available during this epidemic, so that we can avoid these traumatic dilemmas of triage. And at the same time, to balance the needs to save lives with other essential needs. As long as a country, he says, has no shortage in the healthcare system, there's personnel, there's equipment to treat the seriously ill patients, then all individuals would receive maximum care. And that doesn't matter whether or not they've contracted this disease of coronavirus or for that matter, any other disease. And finally, all citizens are required to observe the governmental guidelines. Now, we said that we're not obligated to give up our lives to save someone else. In the case of health professionals, some poskim say it's a little bit different, and that's more or less the way the halacha seems to have accepted it, and they have to expose themselves to danger in order to save lives. That's their responsibility. Therefore, he writes, it is permissible for a medical team to care for a patient with coronavirus. Of course, they have to take all the precautions that they possibly can and have all the equipment that they said that we discussed before. But here on page 38, he quotes two major poskim that are quoted in the Piskei Corona and the Aruch HaShulchan, and they write that this whole issue of triage is very, very complicated. He says we have many, many priorities that we have to consider. What happens, for example, you have a patient who's dying, Nebuch. You have another patient who may have a statistically low rate of survival. And such a person is put on a ventilator because of coronavirus. He says, number one, quoting Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that the first thing that we have to consider is how severely ill is the patient? How likely is it that medical intervention will be beneficial? And there are patients who are in such a, as he calls it, medically compromised state. The likelihood of them benefiting from medical intervention is very low. And therefore, both Rav Shlomo Zalman and other contemporaries, Moshe Feinstein, Rav Waldenberg, and the Tzitz Eliezer, they all came to the conclusion that in triage, if you have a choice, there's only one possibility of saving one person, then you give priority to the individual who has a less compromised medical state and a greater statistical probability of being benefited by medical intervention. He goes on to say that we don't make any determinations that are based on age. The only relevance of age, he says, is determined who has a greater chance of survival. But age per se, younger versus older, is not a halachic consideration. Now, if the critically ill patient is in the process of dying, he's on a ventilator, the chances of survival, very, very low. Now, this is the bottom of page 39. I was hoping with my, I took a deep breath that now he's going to tell me, what do I do in a case where I have one ventilator? I've already allotted it to a person who, as it turns out, has a very low rate of survival, possibility of survival. I was disappointed. I don't know why Dr. Steinberg at this point, again, I'm just giving you my comment here, he seems to drop the ball. And he goes on to say that we can leave sort of well enough alone He says, once we have initiated this medical intervention and he's already on a ventilator, from this point on, he says, the patient need not be longer kept on various monitors to check blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation. We no longer have to adjust the respirator, the parameters of the respirator. And he summarizes by saying that, quote unquote, no resuscitative measures should be done. This is what we call no resuscitation. The man is on a ventilator, and that's a very serious issue, to say the least. So I'm looking in this gigantic essay, which, as I said at the outset, is almost 50 pages long, for him to ask what I consider the main question here in triage. You've already designated this ventilator for a patient. I don't have another ventilator. The hospital has only that one ventilator in that ward. That's the only ventilator that's free. And I know very well, because of this epidemic, that within a certain reasonable amount of time, a short period of time, we're going to need that ventilator. Am I allowed to take that person who's already on a ventilator and transfer that ventilator, or at least free up the ventilator, for someone, some anonymous faceless person who hasn't yet arrived in the hospital, but no doubt will? And the answer to this question should have been on page 40. And I'm looking and looking. But I find here on page 40, he says that a patient who's on a ventilator, he's a coronavirus patient, we've determined that he has a very low chance of survival. He says we can transfer him to a different unit, take him out of the critical care unit, the intensive care unit, and put him in another floor. But we're going to continue to give him all the treatments. We don't have to resuscitate him, but we'll do the best we can.
Rav?
Can you give me just one more minute? Because again, I just want to get the language down. Yeah, go ahead, Joe. I'm sorry. No,
I mean, it's just the Rav has talked about this many times in the past, the difference between doing something active and sheval taseh.
Great.
So the Rav's talked
that's
about
what I'm wondering. What is he going to tell me here? He's going to tell me, okay, I can transfer him to a different unit. I'm going to make space for patients that require critical care who have better chances of survival. But I'm interested in knowing, what am I going to do with that ventilator? So you're telling me, Joe, and we've touched on this in the past, that there's no question in anyone's mind we can't take him off the ventilator.
Right.
He doesn't say that. And I'm about to present to you Rabbi Yitzchok Zilberstein, one of the great poskim of our generation. But let me just finish first with Dr. Steinberg. Again, I just want to convince myself that I'm right. And that Iker Chasam in HaSefer, I get very emotional about this. He seems to be skirting the issue. He says, fine, you can transfer him from intensive care into a regular floor. Then he goes on and picks up another topic. Am I allowed to share one single ventilator with two patients? He says, in a state of scarcity, permitted to do so. Quotes from Herschel Schechter. And Rav Herschel Schechter writes, and we've seen it in the past, that you can split one ventilator, even though you know well that you've reduced the chances that both of the patients will survive. What?
Next question.
Again, I'm sorry. I really apologize. I am going to open up for questions. I
No problem.
just need 5 more minutes, and then the floor. I just want to get, again, I have so much in front of me here. I just want to make sure I'm finished with Dr. Steinberg, and there's nothing here that I missed. He says, a patient with minimum chances of survival who's already connected to a ventilator should not have the ventilator removed. Okay, we can't give up the ventilator. Yeah, but I want to know something else. I want to know if this patient has a minimum chance of survival, and I've got one ventilator in front of me. Do I hook him up to that ventilator? There's no one else now. We've got one ventilator and one patient. He has a low chance of survival. So again, what he does right is that if this patient is already connected to a ventilator, you cannot remove the ventilator. Okay? But I want to know something else, and I don't see this here. I want to know, can I what's the word I want to use? Can I withhold the ventilator? I'm not talking about removing the ventilator. I want to know if you can withhold the ventilator for the sake of someone who has a better chance of survival. He says, quoting some poskim, 243 is where Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg say that in a case of treatment of a terminal patient, okay, he says that perhaps, okay, this is a gigantic machlokes, he has the status of a goses, okay, he's in the final throes of death, so to speak, and we can remove the ventilator in order to save someone who can live a full lifespan. That's Chai Shah and Chai Olam, if you remember. So we're allowed to actively, again, there's a radical position, but nevertheless a position apparently of Rav Zalman Nehemiah, that we can take the ventilator and remove it from someone who's already, he's a treifa, whatever that means. Again, you have to ask a million questions to figure out who that is. And even so, Rav Zalman Nehemiah says that he can breathe on his own for at least a few hours. He's not going to die immediately, because if you take him off the respirator, then you're killing a treifa, which you're not allowed to do. But again, what I'm trying to figure out, and that's what I want to quote this, add a new person into our repertoire here. What about the possibility of not putting a person on a ventilator because of his low chance of survival? Because I want to save that ventilator for Yankel Beryl, who's a faceless, unknown, anonymous person, but I know he's gonna be coming into the hospital. I know the rates over here, and I know what's going on. Okay, now the floor is yours.
So I have a question from before. When it comes to adding a person to a ventilator, right? You say you're allowed to add a person even though you decrease the one already connected chance of survival.
Right.
Right? So wouldn't this be like the machlekes with a bottle of water in the desert?
Right. So he has a note here. If I can read it to you, just 1 second. It's number 240.
Okay.
Okay, now I'm not finding it right now. Just 1 second.
It's on page 40.
Yeah. I know. I have, but that's not the right footnote. So you know what, David? Let me come back to your question, a little bit later on. Okay.
I heard Rav Asher Weiss talk about your particular issue that you just,
right.
The Shayla.
Right.
And he said that you
should have in your email. Yeah.
Right. So he said that you don't have to give him the ventilator because he's considered to be Lefonov. That's actually this person who anonymous hasn't actually arrived. It's as though he's actually in front of you at that particular point in time.
So let's see where Rav Weiss got this from. Again, I have Rav Weiss's pages on my agenda here, but I want to go back to basics. What I have in front of me, and again, until I upgrade my technological skills, so I wasn't able to share this with you. It's just a page that's from Rabbi Yitzchok Zilberstein. I happen to have a great deal of admiration for, not that he needs me for that. Okay, so part of this I'm going to read in the original. Part of it I'll just summarize in English on my own. He says that the hospital has possession of a very sophisticated machine. Let's call it a machine. And it could really be a lifesaver. Now, Magia, who comes to the hospital? Ole, shechayav chai shah. We can keep him alive. I don't know how long, not long. However, if we connect him to this machine, we're not allowed to take him off the machine. Okay, he's not aware of Zalman Nehemiah, who might allow under certain very strict conditions that we could take him off the ventilator. But again, that's way out. He says, we won't be able to detach him, to take him off the machine. There will be a chola to show up in the hospital. With this machine, we can save his entire life, meaning he can live till Mea V'Yesrim, right? He says the following. What do we do? This is the question that was asked him. Should we, b'chol zot, designate this machine, this lifesaver, to this one chola? Or should we say no? We know that some other individual has chances of being saved, a full life, restores health. He's going to be coming in. We know that if we hook up this person to a ventilator, we won't be able to take him off. What should we do? He says, tshuva. He says, l'chora, even though we have this chola who's here, and that chola, he's potential, but he's not here. So then, what should we say? Ulai, shall we say, maybe he means intuitively, Yesh lomar shelo lechabres hacholim shechayim chai shah. Let's not connect this person and designate the machine for him. Today, lahashir samachona pnuya lecholim she'ef shel hatzilam l'chai olam. So I think he's giving you like before he gets into the basics and the sources, he's giving you an intuitive, moral, ethical feeling. But he says here we have a tshuva from the Nod of Yehuda. The Nod of Yehuda, as you know, lived 3 centuries ago. And he was faced with the following question. A person died of a very rare disease. And the question was, can we allow an autopsy so that if someone else will contract that disease, we'll be able to learn and perhaps be able to save lives? I don't know if you're familiar with this famous tshuva. It's like a breakthrough tshuva, the Nod of Yehuda, in biomedical halachic ethics, and he writes, no, we're not allowed to slice the cadaver. There's no room for a heter. We can't believe. Why? Because the Torah overrides isurim, with the exception of the big 3, if we have a chole bifanenu, right? We have someone who's ill and he's right in front of us. Now the Torah says, v'chai b'hem. So if we had another person who was suffering from the same rare disease right here in the hospital, right here in front of us, then we would be allowed to do a post-mortem, cadaver, cut up, in order to try to save his life. But kol od shelo ba lifanenu, ein lavar al isur Torah lema'anu. We cannot violate the Torah law on behalf of someone who's not bifanenu. Okay, that is the famous tshuva of the Noda B'Yehuda.
Ask a question. Okay, so I would say these.
Well, you would answer, David, to your previous question.
Right. I would say these two cases are not at all the same, because one is cutting up a dead body, and the only is just covered a mace. But by here, you may able to sub out them if you don't hook the guy up. So I mean, you got a real isser. They're derisive. They're not the same.
The Issa Doraisa here is a matter of life and death. Lo tamen al dam riacha. You know, you have.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, right. So I'm saying some of the reactions that be who's true doesn't even apply here.
So now says Rav Zilberstein, based on the Chazon Ish, that although the Noda B'Yehuda says that we don't treat a pikuach nefesh situation unless it's chola b'fanenu. However, in a later tshuva after the Noda B'Yehuda, quoted by the Chazon Ish, a tshuva of none other than the Chassam Sofer, he writes that although we don't violate an Issa Torah if it's not chola b'fanenu, he says that there are situations in which it's not like the Noda B'Yehuda. Maybe somebody will contract down the line a disease, but it's cholim shasidim lagia. We have cholim and we know they're going to come. That is called chola b'fanenu. So that in terms of autopsies, this tshuva, the Chassam Sofer, quoted by the Chazon Ish, is a major breakthrough, because here we've assumed, and in Ashkenazic Jewry, this was the assumption for a century and a half, that the Noda B'Yehuda is correct. We need chola b'fanenu, no violation of any Issa without chola b'fanenu. Now we have a different curveball. What we're saying is that the Noda B'Yehuda was talking about a case where yes, maybe no, who knows what's going to be? Is there going to be a chola or not? But if they're cholim hasidim lovo, then it's considered chola b'fanenu. And at this point, based on the Chazon Ish, Rav Yitzchok Zilberstein, now what I'm about to say is just for pedagogical reasons, so what I'm about to say is absolutely false, right? Is going to conclude that we should not give the ventilator to this person who has only Chaye Shah, he's going to live for a few hours, but rather save it for the chola that we know is going to come, because that's called cholim hasidim lovo. And we, you know, if I were taking a deep breath here, I would have told you that Rav Yitzchok Zilberstein, Shlita, is going to simply apply the Chazon Ish straight away. And we're going to come full swing around to what we intuitively thought, let's save the ventilator for the person who's about to come in. I don't know if it'll be in an hour or tomorrow, whenever it is he's going to come in. But I fooled you. I fooled myself. Because at this point, total reversal. He says the following: V'nira, yafilu im naniach shehacholim asidim lagia nechshavim lechol lefanenu. Let's grant the Chazon Ish's premise. I'm not going to question and fight with the Chazon Ish. We know that they're going to be cholim that are coming in. They're lefanenu. He says the following: Muta lavar isurei Torah. You would be allowed, according to the Chazon Ish, to violate Torah law, again, minus the big three, right? For the sake of saving those who are Sidim Lava who are going to come in, because that's considered Lefanein. However, that's not relevant to our discussion. Kol zehu b'nogea l'din pikuach nefesh, lidchos ha'isurim, ach eina nogea le'inyan chiyuv hatzol. Unbelievable. If I can use, the terminology that I'm familiar with from my upbringing, he doesn't use it. It's tzvei dinim. There are two different dinim here, and we should not confuse them. There's one din called pikuach nefesh v'chai b'hem, and that means to override isurim. And there's another din called hatzolah. And he goes on to say that legabe hatzolah ein adayin chiyuv lefanenu. He says, all right, you can tell me, let's violate isurim for those who we know we can anticipate, well, I'm going to do a nituach mes because I know that yenem somebody out there, I don't know who, Nebuch is going to get sick with the same disease in the future. That's fine, pikuach nefesh. But that has no bearing on our issue. Why? Because in our case, we're dealing with another set of rules and regulations, another halachic consideration, which is not pikuach nefesh, but rather chiyuv hatzolah. And he says that even though, with regard to pikuach nefesh, cholim hasidim lava are considered like cholim lefanenu, and mutar lava al isator, we could violate isuritor for those future things. But legabe chiyuv hatzolah, ein adayin. This is the punchline. Ein adayin chiyuv hatzolah kol od she'eno b'fanenu. And he's going to prove this. I'm going to leave the proof for one more minute, but first let me see the conclusion. He says, Lefichach, therefore, yesh lahadif es hachola, even though it's chayav chayisha, but it doesn't matter. The mitzvah of hatzol applies even for chalitza. An hour of life is considered as valuable as life itself. Behu nimtzol afanenu, v'nis chayavnu b'hatzolasa. We are not yet chayav in hatzolah of the other person. So again, if you were asking me, well, am I allowed to violate a lav like losamen al dam riacha, let's call it a lav like eating chazit treif, in order to preserve the ventilator for the next guy? So I'm violating a lav. Okay, you want to know, can I eat chazit treif in order to save the guy who's going to come in whatever, in an hour or two? For sure, yes. But we're dealing with losamen al dam riacha. We're dealing with hashavas nefesh, hashavas aguf. We're dealing with hatzol. Hatzolah, he says, operates with a whole different set of regulations. If the Torah obligates me to designate this ventilator to so-and-so because he's the one who's here, I have no obligation of Hatzolah vis-a-vis the person who hasn't come in yet. B'shtei halachos nemru be'inyan chol sheyesh bo sakon. Aleph, mutar lavar al isurei Torah, shenever v'chai bohem. Beis, haTorah hitilu chiyuv al kol adam ahatzil es hamasukon. We have, and everyone has, the obligation to save he whose life is in danger. The first halacha is derived from the pasuk v'chai bohem, and the Gemara says at the end of Yoma, lo sheyamas bohem. Fine, but what about the second halacha? That halacha, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Chaim Gimel, derives from the mitzvah of hashavas aveda. That it says vashivoso lo, it doesn't say vashivosa lo, and therefore it means we have to give him back his nefesh. The rabos hashavas gufa, and then the Gemara adds the lav of lo saman al damriach, and that adds that although in hashavas avein I don't have to pay money from my pocket, but in the case of lo samod it's a lav like any other lav. I have to spend my last penny to save a person's life, and therefore he says, even if we apply v'chaybev, the cholim were going to come around. When it comes to violating isurim, and you have now a conflict because pikuach nefesh, he says, so as far as violating an isur is concerned, that's where the Chazon Ish says, based on the Chassam Sofer, that it's considered chol lefaneinu. Shechai Yisrael chavivim l'fnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'yisurim nidachim mipnei Chai Yisrael. Avol, here's the big avol, b'nogeh l'chiyuv hatzolah, which is derived, he says, from the mitzvah shavas aveda, chiyuv zeh chal b'shah sheyesh chola b'fanenu mamish. Like I find in aveda, I have to return the aveda. Ach adam bari loader, he knows for sure sheyivka. He says he knows that somebody is going to never get into a car accident. He says, but let's say I would somehow al pi ruach hakodesh, I would know that somebody, is going to get into a car accident. He says adayin ein zu aveda. That's not called aveda. V'einanu chayovim kvar ka'es lahachin avuro mechonos hachya. We don't have any obligation now to prepare this special ventilator, we'll call it, on behalf of someone who's not here. Omnam, he says, midas hachesed. Obviously, chesed is, to care as much as he can to save him when he'll come b'fanenu. But as far as the chiyuv Torah is concerned, adayin ein kan chiyuv. And we don't have an obligation to go out into the shvakim, out into the streets and find an aveda. That's not our obligation. We don't have to go find a person and dig him up because he tomorrow will be rushed into the hospital. That's not our chivat sola. Lachein nireh. This Rav Yitzchok Zilberstein, again, I can't begin to tell you how important he is in our time. And besides which he's Rav Yosh's son-in-law, but that's not relevant to me. He says, Nira di yesh lahatzil sachola muta lefanenu mamish. Af shenitzol rak chai shah. Mishum sha'olav nitztavenu v'ashivosol. This is the piece that I can't understand why it's missing in Dr. Steinberg's presentation. The man has written an article with, about 400 footnotes. And this is mamish, this is the bread and butter of it all. Okay, so you're telling me we already hooked him up to the ventilator. And then you have a tshuva from Rabbi Zalman Nechemia. I'm not belittling Chas Shalom. I'm not saying that that's insignificant. I mean, mind-boggling. Imagine a situation where you're going to remove a ventilator. Okay, but the poskim are not going to go for that. Trust me. But here's a different case. I want to know whether or not I have an obligation to hook this guy up when I could use that ventilator to save someone's life. And admittedly, Rav Zilberstein says intuitively, you would certainly want to do such a thing. And Rav Shechter in his tshuvas that we saw in Piskei Corona advocates that, exactly that. And Rav Steinberg just leaves it out. But here, my friends, you have an unbelievable tshuva that there's no chiyuv hatzola now, according to the Torah law, vis-a-vis this ventilator, for saving someone who's not bifanein. We got to deal with the person who is bifanein. Now, I'll be honest with you. In my humble opinion, the medical halachic experts, they're not gonna like this. This is too tough of a pill to swallow. Could you imagine? You got one ventilator, you're going to designate it for this person because kol hakodim zacha, even though the best you could hope for is chayisha. And Yenem, who's going to come in an hour or in a day, he's going to die because we've already hooked him up to a ventilator. Unless you have Rav Zalman Nechemia in a case where he has a few hours to live and this, that, and the other thing, he can breathe for a few hours, then maybe we'll take him off the ventilator. Maybe. And again, very iffy. So that now Phil mentioned this article called Medical Triage, which I tried to send you in the email. And this is from a Vice. And again, I'm hoping, yeah, please.
Okay, so was the case you just mentioned with the tshuva from Rav Zilberstein, is there some way to make a tanai of sorts, to say, okay, we're going to hook this guy up, the Chayashah guy, until such times we get a real chayla that we can save, and do it all tonight?
I would say the following. I don't even know if you need it tonight. I would say mimanavshah. Are you accepting Rav Shlomo Zalman or are you not? Let's go back to Dr. Steinberg, right? And where does he quote Rav Shlomo Zalman? Number 243 on page 40. And he says, others say that in any case, the treatment for a terminal patient can be stopped and the ventilator may be removed in order to save someone who can live a full lifespan with one condition. So again, you have the following conditions. Number one, the person who's on a ventilator is terminally ill. Number two, the person that you want to save can live a full lifespan. Number three, and this is really the catch-22 here, catch-3 I should call it, as long as the patient is not expected to die right away when they take them off the respirator. They can breathe on their own for at least a few hours. Now that's kind of like this douses the fire a little bit. Imagine you're going to take him off the respirator. He's going to live for a few hours. How much is a few hours? I don't know. He just tells you to look up Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, who has a book called Halacha Urefu'ah, And he published this apparently in a very fine journal called Asya, if you're familiar with, modern, biomedical Jewish ethics. And therefore, David, what I would tell you is I don't think you need a Tanakh. I think what he's saying is that, according to Rav Zilberstein, if you want to, again, Rav Zilberstein is totally unaware of this Rav Zalman Nechemia. I don't think Rav Zilberstein reads Asya. No offense to Asya. It's not on his, radar screen. But Luyitzur, he was aware of Rav Zalman Nechemia's psak. Then he would tell you the following. Right now, I got to put Yankel on the machine. Beryl comes in. He's got Chaye Olam. And now let's take a look at Chaim. What's his situation? If he's terminally ill, if I can take him off the ventilator and he'll still breathe for a couple of hours, then Enochinami, that's what I'll do. But that again is you make a gigantic assumption. I mean, even Dr. Steinberg in his tshuva, he assumes that someone who's already connected to a ventilator should not have the ventilator removed and given to another patient who has better chances. And that he quotes 241, he quotes the Mincha Shlomo, and he quotes the Igus Moshe, and he quotes the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Hershel. Here he waxes very this. Okay. Now, I promise Phil, I want to get back to Rav Weiss. Let's see what he says. It's called Medical Triage. It's 2 pages long. He starts with the introduction that in medical triage, there are 2 major factors. Number 1, the degree of danger, which means that there's a patient who's in grave danger and he gets priority over someone who's not in immediate danger. Okay, fine. And number 2, the likelihood of survival. So you have a patient with a higher likelihood of survival and he gets priority. That's the din of medical triage. Then he goes on to say that there's certain things that are not relevant, and we got to knock that out of our head. For example, age is not relevant. Again, age could be relevant, as we said before, but only indirectly, because it might determine who has a higher likelihood of survival. But that's not always the case. Then he says the following. These guidelines apply only before a patient is connected to a ventilator. And here he's basically taking the hard line, I call it, of the list of poskim here, except for Zalman Nechemia, that forget it. Once connected, one may not disconnect the patient from the ventilator, regardless of prognosis, and even to save someone who is more likely to survive. So, Joe, that's what you and I are familiar with. We have 2 chidushim today. Number 1, Rav Zalman Nechemia, who has the possibility of taking a patient off a ventilator. And number 2, the issue of perhaps, as Rav Shechter would have said it, to delay putting someone on a ventilator because he's got only Chaisha, for the benefit of someone who's not here today, or not here right now, who we assume is going to come, and has Chai Ol. And here we have Rav Zilberstein, who says, no deal, no dice. I will not allow you to forego your Chiyuv Hatzolah of Chai Shah, because that's the fellow who's Bifaneinu. Don't start running through the streets and find someone else who is Chai Ol.
How do you define Chai Ol?
I would say Chai Olam means that he can go back to where he was before he contracted the disease. Meaning, I could really solve his problem. I have therapeutic methods that would bring him back to restore his health. How long he's going to live, I don't know. That's Bidei Shamayim. But I could restore his health. That's called Chai Olam. There's another person that we have life support. We can keep him going for X number of hours, but that's Chai Olam. Now he writes the following. I say with tremendous fear and trepidation, we're dealing with life and death. If there truly becomes a ventilator shortage and patients are continuously arriving and require ventilation, and the present patient has very little chance of survival, it is my humble opinion that the medical team may withhold the ventilator from the present chole b'fanenu in order to save the patient, who again, what kind of patient? Patient who is arriving, right? He's not here. I mean, I know that he means that because he describes this particular patient as chole b'fanenu. So obviously, he is coming up with this very big chiddush, and he says it with tremendous fear. And he says, no, it's like chole b'fanenu. And he quotes the Chazon Ish, the same Chazon Ish that Rav Yitzchok Zilberstein quoted, who says that the tshuva of the Noda B'Yehuda doesn't apply because we're talking about a situation where there's a continuous flow of cholim, and therefore it becomes a situation which is chole b'fanenu, even though he's not b'fanenu. And therefore, what do we do if a critically ill patient with very little chance of survival arrives in the emergency room? There's one ventilator remaining, and what happens? He says, "Oh, this is interesting. I wonder what Rav Zilberstein would say about this." They get a call from the ambulance dispatcher who informs the hospital that a young man with an excellent chance of survival is en route, and will we save the ventilator for him? Ah, that's fascinating. Let's assume, again, I don't know what halachic consideration there is or significance there is to get this phone call. I don't know if I have a chiv hatzola vis-a-vis that fellow who's en route. But again, you see the gray area here, yesh tzaddim lekan ulekan. But if you'll grant me for one moment the literary license to assume that en route is not b'fanenu. And here Rav Zilberstein says, I have a chiv hatzola for the person who is b'fanenu. I may know that you're about to get chas v'shalom into an accident, you're about to drop a wallet in the street and you'll lose it. I'm not chayiv an hatzola for your wallet until it's b'fanenu. And the pellet to me is, and that's when I get back to Phil's comment from before, when he says that, that Rav Weiss has already addressed this issue. He addresses the issue, but he seems, again, unless I'm wrong, and if I'm wrong, as Chatayri Maski, he seems to be totally oblivious to the very powerful logical reasoning of Rav Yitzchok Zilberstein. Okay, there are both sides. Now, we have perhaps 5 to 10 minutes left. What I'd like to do is, because I started with Rabbi Tversky, I'd like to make a siyum on it. Again, it's 10 pages long. We're up to page 6, which means we're halfway through. And he writes the following. Let me just have all these pages bifanenu. He says the following, that governmental allowances, he says, because again, he's fighting the following battle, as you remember from last week, that the government allows us to open schools, etc. He says, he thinks, not only should we be very wary about relying on government because they don't know what suffix sakana is, as we discussed at great length last week, but more than that, he thinks that the sakana is going to increase once government begins to reopen society, because the rates of contagion will increase. And Navi, he wrote this a month ago, and as you know, the clock changes from 1 hour to the next. And here in Israel, over the last, I think it's 2-3 days, we had another 300 of, I don't know how many cases of coronavirus. And all this comes from the schools, by the way. I haven't yet heard, if somebody could correct me, about the shuls. I daven in a major shul 3 times a day. So far, I don't know. I haven't heard anyone blaming it on the shuls. They're blaming it now on the schools, for the most part. And this seems to be a second round of the contagion. Again, some of the health people are saying, don't panic yet. They add the word yet. Others are saying, well, panic in about 6 months, but don't panic yet. Now, Rav Tversky Shlita, quotes a source of the Mishnah Berurah in Bir Halacha, which I am not familiar with. If anyone could get access to this, because honestly, I don't know what Rav Chorsky wants from this. He says there's a Bir Halacha in Orach Chaim Siman Tuf Reish Yud Ches, Divra Maskil Chole. And he says, if the doctors are being strict, one must investigate if perhaps the doctors are being overly strict, as they are unaware of the mandate of a chayba. Now, this is out of context. I don't know what exactly is going on over here. I mean, I remember my father's Zilberstein used to tell me that when he was the chaplain in the Coney Island Hospital, when he had a shaila about whether a patient should fast on Yom Kippur, then if he asked a non-Jewish doctor, the doctor would almost inevitably say he should fast. If he asked a Jewish doctor, I don't want to be motzi las, but anyway, my father had a certain pain from this whole thing. But the Goyim appreciated Yom Kippur in the hospital. Anyway, so I don't know. He says maybe the doctor's being overly strict and Ke'ilu required you to fast on Yom Kippur. I mean, obviously that's not the case, and they're unaware of a chayba. That on the one hand, it's wonderful fasting on Yom Kippur, but what about the chayba? So he said. So Rav Chorsky adds to this comment to the Mishnah Berurah. He says, obviously the same holds true for those who are aware of a chayba, but practically they don't know how to apply this mandate in the case of remote risks. So somehow he makes an equation and he flips it around. And if the Mishnah Berurah is telling you that the doctors are overly strict, whatever that means, that's because they're not aware of the mandate of a chaybohem. And then he wants to say that there are those who are aware of a chaybohem, but they don't know how to apply it. So they think that a chaybohem means that at certain points we shouldn't open up the shuls, but at other points we should open up the shuls. And he's worried about the remote suffix here, that it might... And then he has a whole long discussion here about two types of Talmidei Chacham. And he says there are some Talmidei Chachamim who understand the halacha very well, but they're lacking in understanding how the halacha should be applied in a practical realm. So we need both. And he, again on page 7, if you happen to have this, he quotes in the box in the middle of a Gemara in Beitza and another Gemara in Menachos. And the Gemara says that although we have a concept called halacha ve'ein morin, in other words, theoretically this is the halacha, but we can't propagate that because practically it's going to bounce back in our face. So there are certain leniencies that we cannot publicize because if we do, who knows how far they're going to go with it. And for example, the Gemara Menachos says that we will violate the Shabbos for the sake of Eidim. I think he's talking about Chum, that if they saw the new moon, they can travel on Shabbos to Bezdin to testify. And the reason why we're going to do this is because to make sure that people know exactly how significant it is to come and give that aid. So again, you have all sorts of practical considerations. And he says that it may be a nice theoretical idea to come to the conclusion that now the rate of danger is so low that we can get our shuls back on their feet and running again. He says that might be true on a theoretical level, conceptually, but we have to know how to apply halach in a practical realm. And therefore, what's going to happen is, he says, that we have to be aware of the danger once we start letting our guard down. He says, even if I were to grant you that there are situations where there are popular attitudes to danger that carry weight, I think he's referring to what's called Shomer Psoyim Hashem. You remember the famous or infamous tshuva Rav Moshe Feinstein about smoking, that we're all doing it, and therefore Shomer Psoyim Hashem. When I was a youngster, I had a Rebbe who came from Litha. he used to smoke half cigarettes. He wanted to make sure he could get the most out of the cigarette. So he cut it in half, and he would smoke a half a cigarette till his fingers were yellow, right? So Shomer P'sayim Hashem. He says in our situation, we take no notice of these attitudes of people. People who are saying, okay, we can do this, we can go back to shul, and we don't have to worry about danger. And he says that people are making major mistakes. They're not distinguishing between medical knowledge and scientific surmise. If you remember, we discussed this last time. Others are in error because they let themselves be convinced by and rely upon the policies of the government, and they don't appreciate the extent of the Torah's mandate of a chayva, or I would have said ushmatim yodas nafshasecha. Others, he said, this is a little bit tricky. He writes, others exaggerate the importance of tefillah b'tzibur. Okay, I would say it's not just tefillah b'tzibur; it's tefillah b'beis haknesses. Tefillah b'tzibur, you can go on the porch and maybe you'll get tefillah b'tzibur, or out there in the parks, maybe you get tefillah b'tzibur. We have across the street from the Hamic Learning Center, we have something called the Goat Park, and sometimes we get a nice minion out there in the Goat Park. But I'm more worried about tefillah b'beis haknesses, because our beis haknesses is a migdash ma'at. The Sefer Torah in the Aron is a replacement, so to speak, for the Aron shtei luchos habris, the luchos ha'evis, where the Shechina resides, bein hakruvim. So I want the beis haknesses. I want to get that Shechina. It's nice to have a minion outside, but I don't know if that's going to do it for me. I need the beis haknesses. And he says, let's say there was a smoker today who is unaware of that's why I thought he's referring to that tshuva, who's unaware of the fatal effects of his smoking habit. He says, would we say that smoking is no longer a suffix sakana because he's unaware of the danger? I mean, there might be something called Shomer P'sayim Hashem when people don't know, but if now we know, it's no longer P'sayim. You can't call them P'sayim. P'sayim are those who are honestly relying on something. He says, therefore, people are perplexed. Society is reopening, re-engaging in a wide variety of non-essential activities. Stores are reopening. People are streaming to the beaches. Hotels are opening. We go out for walks. And how can it be that the Batei Knesios and the Batei Midrashos remain shuttered? But he says it's critical that we strengthen ourselves and others in this regard. He says, we have different goals, we have different standards, and our paths inevitably will divert greatly from the Hey Mashkimim, and therefore don't rely on societal behavior, on governmental guidelines. That's no indication of correct halachic behavior. And to make a long story short, he is opposed to opening the shuls. Now, as far as I know, he still maintains the same position. And my proof is because this has been circulated most recently. He originally wrote this in Hebrew, and it was only recently translated into English. And his introduction, as I think I mentioned at the outset, to this entire essay, which is 10 type pages long, is that Rav Shechter saw the piece and told him that it's a mitzvah to publicize. So I really have a strong inclination that
Rav Shechter said what?
That Rav Shechter, if I could read it, he says the following. He says, Rav Shechter said to me that, in my opinion, meaning in Rav Shechter's opinion, it's very accurate, meaning whatever Rav Tversky writes is accurate, and it's a mitzvah to publicize it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I get the impression that since this was, I got this a week ago, well, maybe we spoke about it a week ago, so maybe we got it 10 days ago, whatever it was, and it's the English translation of his original essay, and he's insisting that Rav Shechter held mitzvah lefarsimos. So I'm assuming, unless I'm wrong, that he still maintains that position. Now, whether or not Shomer P'sayim Hashem will apply here, I think, in my humble view, it all depends upon that chiluk, that distinction that tremendous debt of gratitude to Rav Tversky for this distinction, so fundamental, between a psak halacha on behalf of the entire community and one for individuals. So, for example, if 10 individuals or whatever the number might be decide for whatever reason that the situation is very well, under a cap, again, meaning social distancing, you want to talk about masks, whatever you want to talk about. And he feels that he's in a non-risk situation. Or, for example, someone who already had the disease and then tested negative on a number of occasions, who, again, nobody knows, but they give him a very low likelihood of contracting the disease again within a certain period of time, within 6 months or whatever it might be, and he's not going to infect any others. Whatever the situation is, but you researched it and you have reason to believe that the guidelines and the guards, the shmirah in that particular synagogue is, we're in the ELC, we're up to week number 5. This will be the 6th Shabbos that we're open. We only allow 22 people, and every person has an assigned seat. You have to register in advance, you have to clean your hands, and you have to sit at a distance, and all the rest, and masks and the whole thing. And the next topic, which I want to discuss with you today, is the tshuva of Shechter, which is number 38, but we don't have time for that today. Maybe we'll start with that next week, about having one person, this is what we do in the ELC, one person lane all the aliyos, read the Haftorah. We got rid of Maftir, this is an abridged version, and it's all based on various tshuvas. And he's the same person who does Hagba. He's the same person who takes the Aron takes the Sefer Torah out of the Aron. And it's literally a one-man show, and that limits or restricts the amount of time that people are near each other. So that's a tshuva. And I think on an individual level, that's one thing. You want to decide for yourself. But Rav Twersky is worried about a decision of a rabbinical board, whether it's the RCA, whether it's the Agudo, whether it be the OU, whatever organization you might talk about, to say, let's open up the shuls because the government gave us permission to do so. And that's where he's fighting his battle. There's another tshuva here that I thought was fascinating from Rav Shechter, and that's Corona tshuva number 39, about women. Are the women allowed to join these minyanim? Now, we have a mechitza, but let's say we're davening outside, there's no mechitza. Well, let's say a person is davening b'yechidus at home. Is his wife allowed to be in close proximity? So that's a very fascinating tshuva, and he has really good, solid lumdus. All right, I'm going to open up for questions if anybody wants, and if not, again, thank you all for coming. And we should hear great news. And that's about it.
Right.
Okay, thank you so much.